We all know security on the internet isn't all it should be. The data breaches are common and becoming more common still. Security on the internet is, in fact, poor. At the tail end of last year, a luxury hotel chain in Vietnam left their customer database exposed to the internet without any password at all. Data included customers' booking status, their flight information, their name, age, gender, phone number, email address, and credit card information. The database was hosted on the same machine as their web server, and after being notified, it took the chain 2 weeks to password protect the database. Last month, in what I could only be considered a complete compromise of network integrity, New York's Stewart International Airport was found exposing 760 gigabytes of backup data to the public internet. No password, no username, no authentication whatsoever. The leaky data set included everything from sensitive TSA letters of investigation to employee social security numbers, network passwords, and 107 gigabytes of email correspondence. The data was exposed to the public internet for over a year. More than a few years ago now, Mark Zuckerberg famously stated that privacy should no longer be considered a social norm. Zuckerberg was right, at least at the time, but I think there's a serious privacy backlash coming. I really don't think the current age, where privacy can no longer be assumed, where it's not a social norm, is going to survive the coming of the Internet of Things. At the start of the year, another hotel, this time in Austria, suffered a ransomware attack. But this time the attack wasn't against the hotel's databases, but its physical infrastructure. The attackers compromised the hotel's electronic key system. Now, despite initial reports in the media, customers were not locked in their rooms. They were, however, locked out of them, at least until the hotel paid the ransom in Bitcoin. This was the third such attack that particular hotel had suffered. And it gets worse. Did anyone see this one in the news? This is recently discovered Cloud Pets, the company behind Cloud Pets, essentially an internet-connected teddy bear for your kids that lets you record messages and sort of play them to them when you're traveling, had left their database exposed publicly to the internet without so much as a password to protect it. The database included references to 2.2 million voice recordings of parents and children. And with those references, you could retrieve the actual recordings from Amazon S3, because that also, too, had no protection whatsoever. The person that originally discovered this tried to contact Cloud Pets 3 times without any response. Then this database, too, was subject to a ransomware attack. The Cloud Pets data was accessed many times by unauthorized parties before being deleted and then held for ransom. But the troubling thing is the amount of data that lives online right now is a lot smaller than the data that's still out there in the world, distributed, scattered. This data isn't in the cloud yet because it exists in systems that are, at least right now, not connected to a network or unreliably connected to a network. And this data, far more than the data we push up into the cloud, is what makes up our data exhaust. Willingly, unwillingly, unknowingly in many cases, we leave data behind us as we move through the world. Shreds of our digital identity, if you will. Data as infrastructure, in other words. And if data is infrastructure, then just like any other infrastructure, it has to be resilient. It has to be available when needed. It can't drop offline because of a data center outage or a forgotten domain renewal. It has to be robust. Data must be verifiable and reliable, and crucially must be resilient to tampering. And finally, it has to be scalable. Having vital data in a single host or a single connected device will not scale up when that data set is in high demand. And right now, just like the Internet of Things, there's a huge amount of hype around something called blockchain. Now, the blockchain concept isn't exactly as new as it seems. It's called blockchain because a slightly broken version of a Merkle tree doesn't sound quite as sexy when you're looking for VC money. But there are possibilities here so long as you take away the confusing cryptocurrency stuff that's tangled up with it. Essentially, blockchain is just a way to write a record, a log of events. They're designed to be immutable and to have the data written into them and then available forever. That seems a desirable quality when we're dealing with data as infrastructure. And nowadays, when most people say blockchain, and even when I say it myself, it's actually shorthand for undefined radically distributed storage technology. And that's probably going to be needed. Because right now, the solution to almost everything with the Internet of Things is the cloud. Our connected devices talk to the cloud. Our mobile devices talk to the cloud. And in the cloud, most of the smarts of the smart devices live. In the longer term, I think we're going to have to see a much more mixed model where edge devices start talking amongst themselves. Privacy, security starts to become far more important when real physical implications are going to happen to the user. For the most part, the security in the digital internet is about confidentiality. For years, security industry has all been about trying to prevent data theft. Stolen data can be used for identity theft and then fraud. It can be embarrassing. The Ashley Madison breach springs to mind, if anyone remembers that. It can even be a national security threat. But all these breaches are breaches of privacy and confidentiality. And the problem with the Internet of Things, which many security professionals and architects haven't figured out yet, is that security has to be different. For the Internet of Things, security isn't necessarily about confidentiality. It's not actually really about the data anymore. Integrity and availability threats can be much more damaging for connected devices. And some classes of attack that would be a nuisance for a normal network server, for a network-connected device can be fatally disruptive. And this is especially true of those devices where resources are limited. For instance, ones that runs off batteries. Because we're not just embedding sensors anymore, we're embedding actuators and controls. And that means a denial of service attack can take on a whole new meaning. There's a big difference between bringing a website down and locking someone out of their house or their hotel room. And of course, when I'm talking about denial of service attack, I don't necessarily just mean bits and bytes anymore. If a thing consumes physical resources, repeatedly triggering it will often consume more of those resources and eventually exhaust them and make the thing just not work. Or to consider a device that's controlling a relay connected to some heavy piece of industrial machinery that's extremely expensive. Tripping the relay on and off extremely rapidly is going to make the thing it's connected to break, possibly catastrophically. And while the concepts of mal-data and data spam aren't really in wide circulation yet, they will be. For instance, feeding false data to your neighbor's soil sensors could lead them to under or overwater their crops, which means that your own crop might sell for a higher price. This is where blockchain-like concepts of data immutability might well come in handy. We might even have to start thinking about architectures where not all the actors are necessarily trusted. We might get to the point where we need to design systems where bits of software can successfully lie to each other, and that doesn't break things. There's been some interesting research on agent architectures, multi-agent systems, where this is actually something that can happen. One leading indicator for this sort of attack, for this sort of mal-data attack, is the recent spate of fabricated data leaks. These are purportedly data sets of accounts and personal information originating with websites and cloud services, except they are almost entirely fabricated from thin air. The email addresses might be real, but nothing else associated with them is. The other information, date of birth, for instance, are just wrong. Of course, there's a whole extra discussion to be had at that point about what causes a bundle of data to be fabricated and called a breach in the first place. Attempts to monetize the data by selling the alleged breach, perhaps, extortion of money from the company involved, or just simply bragging rights for individuals seeking notoriety. These are all feasible explanations for these fabricated data sets, and I think we'll see the same, or in fact have already started to see the same sort of thing with the Internet of Things. Fabricated data, distorted data. And in an interconnected world, it's hard to predict the effects of one system on another. Back in September last year, ING's main data center in Bucharest was severely damaged during a fire extinguisher test. Apparently, the system was overpressurized, and the loud noise of the inert gas being released by the halon system destroyed dozens of hard drives. The noise forced the hard drive heads into the platters. I didn't even know that was a thing. That's a thing, apparently. And you might argue that's nothing to do with the Internet of Things, privacy or security, but I'm going to argue otherwise. Because, of course, that almost inevitably brings us to Stuxnet. Now, who remembers Stuxnet? Yeah, I thought this audience might remember Stuxnet. Now, just in case, there were a few hands that didn't go up, in case someone in the audience hasn't heard of it, and a few years have passed now, so I guess that's possible. Stuxnet was the first breed of malicious code. It attacked in 3 phases. First of all, it targeted Microsoft Windows machines and networks, replicating itself across the networks. Second, it sought out Siemens Step 7 software, which is a piece of Windows-based software used for industrial control systems. Finally, it compromised the PLCs, programmable logic controllers, attached to those boxes. But crucially, only if they were operating a very small range of variable frequency drives, centrifuges, in other words. The worm's authors could then spy on those industrial systems and then cause the fast-spinning centrifuges to tear themselves apart. Now, most speculation identifies Stuxnet'S targets as Iranian nuclear plants carrying out uranium enrichment. As many as 60% of the identified infected machines were in Iran. And the complexity of the worm at the time it was released, which was a few years ago now, sort of implies there was a nation state behind it. We won't further speculate which nation state, shall we? However, if anyone thinks Stuxnet was a one-off, an aberration, then don't. It was a high-profile flag for what's coming as more and more sensors and actuators are put onto public-facing networks. Because there are going to be much softer targets to go after than IR-1 centrifuges operating with uranium hexafluoride. In fact, I actually think most big attacks against the Internet of Things will almost inevitably trade sophistication for scale. Because especially for consumer devices, most people don't seem to be thinking about failure modes when they design the systems, when they build the systems. When you design a connected device, you have to think about what the state of the device should be if it fails, or if it simply loses a network connection. And this is especially true for those connected devices, which are most of them right now, where the smarts actually live in the cloud rather than on the device. This is the PetNet Smart Feeder. It's an automatic feeding device that manages portion size, food supply, and meal times for your pets, your furry friends, all through an iPhone app. Back in July last year, the PetNet Smart Feeder had a server outage, and the devices stopped working. The servers were down for around 12 hours. Some, not all, but some of the smart feeders stopped feeding their furry charges. What would have happened if the outage had lasted longer? What about other network problems? The cat dies should never be a failure mode for an Internet of Things device. This sort of thinking isn't an isolated problem, however. Both the Nest and the Hive smart thermostats have suffered similar sorts of poorly thought out failure mode problems. The Nest froze its users, and the Hive baked them. The Nest case has suffered from a mysterious software bug that drained its batteries and turns people's homes into deep freezes in the middle of the night. This didn't happen to a few customers. The device went haywire all across the United States. Or in my case, if you'd imported a device from the United States and installed it in your UK home. Oops. The fault was tracked back to a firmware update in the thermostat that had happened in the thermostat a couple of weeks before. The fix was a 9-step procedure, including a manual restart, which involved unscrewing and attaching the thermostat from the wall. In many cases, Nest had to send electricians to confused customers. Large-scale deployment of consumer-facing Internet of Things devices are still somewhat rare. If you have to point to one, Nest is probably the largest one there is, or the Philips Hue light bulbs, perhaps. But even now, firmware updates are problematic. And with the more things, they're going to become more problematic still. A couple of months ago, Half of the 120,000 Chromebooks deployed in Montgomery County School District near Washington, D.C. were rendered unresponsive by a firmware update. Now think of the consequences if that had been half the homes in Montgomery County. That's a possibility with the rollout of smart meters for electricity. This, in fact, is the first proof of concept ransomware for a smart thermostat. It was demonstrated at DEF CON last year. Now, like a lot of smart devices right now that are getting deployed, this particular model of thermostat is just basically another Linux box. And that means not only does it have vulnerabilities unique to the Internet of Things, it has all the vulnerabilities in 0 days of a standard Linux distribution. And the Linux distributions used in Internet of Things devices tend to be old, generally to support proprietary binary blobs to drive hardware. And they're rarely updated once the device is deployed into the field. And of course, one of the real difficulties in the Internet of Things security is that unlike normal servers, Internet of Things devices are replicated. Once designed and built, embedded devices are mass-produced. There may be thousands of millions of identical devices out there, and once an attacker is able to build a successful attack against one of these, that attack can be replicated against all of the devices in the world. Which is why there have now been at least 3 large-scale botnets consisting solely of CCTV cameras. Right now, at least, IP cameras seem particularly vulnerable. They're widely used, and even when the manufacturer does do security updates, users rarely install them. Which brings us, of course, to Mirai. Mirai is a piece of malware that identifies vulnerable IoT devices using a table of more than 60 common factory default usernames and passwords. Then it logs into them, it takes them over, and forms part of a botnet. Infected devices continue to function perfectly normally, except for the occasional sluggishness and an increased use of bandwidth. Most users with an infected camera don't even notice anything is wrong. The types of devices that have taken over, for the most part, just IP cameras. But despite that, the botnets that created by Mirai malware have been used to perform some of the largest and most disruptive distributed denial of service attacks ever recorded. The source code for Mirai has been published. You can download it on GitHub. Go build your own botnet. Or no, rather, please don't. And the thing that drives me insane is that the vulnerabilities that Mirai uses are well known. A few years before it arrived, the Russian website started to aggregate thousands of poorly secured webcam feeds. The site listed streams both by manufacturer. Falsecam was and still is the worst offender when it comes to security, and location. The cameras were from over 250 countries around the world, and there are over 4,500 in the US alone. The site still exists. The camera feeds are now somewhat moderated for content, mostly. Although I doubt the owners of the cameras that are on it are any more aware now than they were a few years back when the site first started. This is the output of a search I did on Shodan, the Internet of Things search engine, for a model of IP camera I know to be particularly vulnerable. There are feeds from shops, offices, storage rooms, nurseries. Baby monitors are especially easy to hack, and they often have audio and panning capabilities. In 2013, a family in Houston, Texas revealed that they had heard voices shouting lewd comments at their 2-year-old child coming out their Falsecam baby monitor. Later in that year, the Chinese-based company provided a software fix that prompted owners to revise default login credentials, but many owners are unlikely to actually have installed it. There's still plenty of Falsecam cameras out there in the wild that are vulnerable. For instance, a similar incident occurred in Ohio a few months back now. This time the child in question was just 10 months old. But of course, it's not just cameras. This, for instance, is the global distribution of hosts infected by the Karna botnet. Now, the Karna botnet is a piece of internet history, and I really love it. It was a great thing. It was actually sort of interesting. Unlike most of the pieces of malware that were built at the time. This one attacked small embedded devices, so the precursors of today's Internet of Things devices, rather than desktop computers. And it was designed for research purposes, built by an anonymous researcher to measure the extent of the internet in what the creator called the Great Internet Census of 2012. I told you it was a piece of history now. The botnet made use of almost trivial exploitable security vulnerabilities, just like Mirai, making use of default passwords, for instance. And as the author concludes, a lot of devices and services we've seen during our research should never have been connected to the public internet at all. As a rule of thumb, if you believe that nobody would connect that to the internet, really nobody. There are at least 1,000 people that did. And as Mirai proved, in the 4 to 5 years since Karna, nothing has changed. In fact, things have gotten worse. A month or two ago, a hacker compromised 150,000 insecure printers in, they said, an effort to raise awareness about leaving printers exposed online outside a firewall and without security settings enabled. The hack affected printers manufactured by a wide range of companies, HP, Epson, Canon, and it came close on the heels of a report which outlined security vulnerabilities present in printers from most of the major manufacturers. Right now, at least, if you don't have any CCTV cameras, the most vulnerable thing in your office is probably your printer. But that's going to change. And remember those internet-connected teddy bears? Well, ignoring the massively insecure database issue, if you possibly could, they're also vulnerable to direct attack. Anyone within range, 10 meters with a normal smartphone or more, much more with a directional antenna, can just connect to them. And once you're connected, you can send and receive commands and data. In other words, the teddy bears can be turned into remote surveillance devices and used to harass toddlers, much like those insecure baby monitors. And this is because they were architected, they were built without any thought to real security. You're putting these things in people's homes, in your children's bedrooms, and no one is thinking about the way they're built. This toy exemplifies the put a chip in it mindset that has led to where we are today. To get out of this mess, manufacturers, developers, architects have to think about how to secure the connected products right from the beginning. The first thing people have to think about is security, not the last. People have to think about how to secure applications storing data, both in the cloud and on the connected device itself, as well as basic network security and encryption for the data in transit. Because it gets worse, this is the Hopper LifeCare PCA3 drug pump, better known as the least secure IP device ever built. Not only does it have a telnet server, if people are old enough in the room to remember those, where you can connect, it gives you a root shell without any authentication. It also has an embedded web server that allows you to attacker to tamper with the pump's operation in real time using fairly simple commands. There's no authentication on that either. Someone built this, sold it, and decided that was a good idea. But that's not actually the worst thing about this pump. The pump also stores the wireless keys used to connect to the local hospital device network in plain text. And you can buy these on eBay. I own 2. In 1995, you wore a digital watch that was also a calculator, and your house was filled with clocks doing this. In 2025, everything in your home will have an IP address. And for the exact same reason, it's quite possible the password will be whatever the manufacturer set it to in the factory. And that's being made worse by something that really hasn't been talked about very much when it comes to the Internet of Things yet. That's not being taken into the architecture of how these devices are built, how long these products are supposed to live. Unlike cell phones, people just flat out aren't going to buy new lighting systems, ovens, fridges, washing machines every 2 years. The average age of the car in the United States is over 10 years old. The average refrigerator, 15. But how long till most manufacturers abandon the current generation of smart devices? The whole idea of Internet of Things abandonware is actually horrifying. Because right now, most Internet of Things devices being sold to customers have the same architecture. There's a thing, there's an app that talks to a thing, and there's a cloud service supporting both the app and the thing. The business model behind these device services is also fairly standard. Consumers make a one-time purchase of the thing, but don't commit to any sort of subscription to support the cloud service that makes the thing smart in the first place, which in the longer term will almost inevitably force manufacturers to abandon the products. And this model is forced on the companies selling things because the digital internet has made most consumers unwilling to subscribe to services. And while they might be willing to purchase a thing, a physical device that they can hold in their hands, they expect software and services to be free. A series of almost accidental circumstances has led to the world where most of the digital internet is free at point of use. It doesn't mean it's free, just that we pay for it in different ways, mostly our privacy. This is the GarageJet. I have no idea how to pronounce that. It's a smart garage door controller that was overfunded at Indiegogo about a year ago now. Just 4 days ago, a customer reported problems with the device on the community forums. Shortly afterwards, not getting any response in the community forums, it was Saturday evening after all, you might want to give them a little bit of slack, the customer posted a 1-star review on Amazon, advising people not to buy the product. In response, the founder of the startup behind the company posted to Amazon with the customer's device ID, informing him they would be locked out of the cloud service that stood behind it. Effectively, the company bricked the customer's device. After a somewhat predictable outcry on the internet, the manufacturer has, a few days later now, restored service. I have no news whether the customer actually has it working or not. The fundamental divide between consumers that have trained to expect free services and the hardware companies that are unable, or in this case, just unwilling, to provide them remains. The business model behind connected devices we're building fundamentally affects the architectural choices we're making while building them. Customer outrage when those architectural choices rebound on us will fundamentally affect how we build them in the future. What happens when, if, that small startup behind the garage door opener files for bankruptcy, bricking everyone's devices? Because that won't be the first time that's happened. The fabric of our homes is far more static than many companies used to operating on internet time seem to have assumed. The business model of a one-time purchase of a thing relies on ongoing service to make it smart, appears unsustainable. It's proved so fragile, I'm left in doubts whether cloud-centered architectures are the right fit for Internet of Things devices, at least those aimed at the consumer market. Possibly the industrial market is a different thing. Oftentimes, it would be far better if these smart devices talk to one another rather than requiring an internet connection at all. But the cloud is always going to have to be there, because it's always going to have to be there for firmware updates, which the consumers don't really want to apply, and security updates, which they better apply. In the longer term, then, both consumers and companies may well have to settle for subscription services to support the smart devices. And you can see this as being easy enough to sustain for things that require consumables. The razor blade business model, where the razors are cheap and the blades are expensive, is well established. But even there, consumers are reluctant to commit to ongoing subscriptions. Subscriptions may face stiffer resistance when traditionally the thing has no ongoing costs except eventual replacement. Light switches, for instance. Do you really want to start up a subscription for light switches in your home? Companies may have to accept graceful degradation of functionality for their smart things. For instance, a smart light switch may gradually become dumber and after a while become something that you can use to turn a light on and off from the wall instead of a smart internet connected device at all. This is especially true as many of the new connected devices replicate or extend the functionality of our homes. After all, what is the lifespan of a typical non-smart thermostat? When was the last time you replaced your thermostat, unless you've gone and bought a smart one? Why would consumers, mainstream consumers, not alpha geeks like us, but mainstream consumers, expect a smart thermostat to live any shorter amount of time than the one they were replacing, which has probably been in their home for 20 years? For a new class of device which consumers aren't familiar with, or have so far managed to live without, the value proposition is limited. Consumer reluctance obvious. And of course, once a piece of abandonware leaves your home, you have to think about where it's going. An estimated 250,000 tons a year of used electrical products are flood into West Africa and Asia. Their appliances are dismantled by unprotected workers, oftentimes children, who remove small pieces of metal to be sold. The remaining plastics and cables are often dumped or burnt. But what's less well known, if that doesn't bother you enough, is that the workers also extract hard drives to harvest personal information for fraudulent use. And this is going to be an increasing problem with the arrival of more and more connected devices that store more and more private information. And you were worried about those things ending up on eBay. Of course, some of the vulnerabilities arise from how we're used to looking at security in the first place. In the past, a great deal of computer security has relied on the fact, has assumed the end user will have no physical access to the computer. If an attacker has physical access to the computer, to the keyboard, then there's no way to stop them from compromising the security of the server or the computer. But the whole point of the Internet of Things is that they're physical things that you hold in your hand. And seriously, would you really want to trust that ATM? Anyone that knows anything about Cisco routers would not be taking money out of that one. That's all I'm saying. And physical access to the Internet of Things device is going to be a real security problem. This is the Ring smart doorbell. It briefly suffered from a really rather intriguing security problem. So the Ring is actually a pretty nice Internet of Things device. It can send an alert to your smartphone every time the doorbell is pressed. It has an inbuilt camera, speaker, and microphone, so you can see who is at the door and talk to them, even if you're not at home. Unfortunately, when the doorbell first shipped, you used to be able to put it into setup mode and retrieve the SSID and password for the last wireless network the bell was connected to, which, by the way, would be your home network, just by unscrewing it, removing it from the wall, flipping it over, and pushing the orange button on the back. When the problem was discovered, it was almost immediately fixed by a firmware patch by the manufacturer. The interesting thing here, though, is this is the Fitbit Aria scales, and it suffered almost exactly the same security problem, except all you have to do here is flip the scales over and push the button. And the reason that both these products suffered from such similar problems is they both relied on the same underlying radio firmware. The firmware on board the radio hardware was actually where the problem is, and the manufacturer of the radio hardware, they're disinclined to fix it. If you're building your system on top of that particular chipset, you have to fix it yourself. This is the iKettle. I'm British. I couldn't possibly not mention kettles. It also has a very similar problem, although you don't even need to physically access the kettle this time. You can drive by the owner's house, deauthenticate it from the owner's Wi-Fi network, and gain access. It's trivial to log in because due to a coding flaw, the PIN number for the kettle is never actually updated by the Android app, ever. And once you have control, you can force the kettle to turn itself on and stay that way. Yeah. One of the things you should worry about this lack of security is that while the Internet of Things has its root in the web architectures of the .com era, the industrial Internet has its roots in the SCADA systems of the early 60s. And the minimal security that's being thrown over the legacy SCADA systems before they're exposed to the public networks is oftentimes laughable. But this hasn't stopped people taking their legacy SCADA systems and hooking them to the Internet, because that's just too much fun. And this leads to problems, like the attack at the beginning of last year on the Ukrainian power grid. Here, malware infected at least 3 regional power authorities in the Ukraine and led to power failure that left hundreds of thousands of homes without electricity. The initial malware attack infected production SCADA systems and allowed the attackers to open the breakers, resulting in power outages. Interestingly, it was followed by other follow-on attacks designed to extend those outages, including a denial-of-service attack against the phone system to stop customers reporting the loss of power in the first place. The current theory is the workers carried the malware, RAT software, that allowed attackers to control the computers that controlled the power into the control room on their phones. This was the result of a phishing campaign that directly targeted IT staff and system administrators working for multiple companies responsible for distributing electricity throughout the Ukraine. This method of infection for large-scale control systems is actually pretty common. One nuclear power plant in Germany was recently found to be infected with several computer viruses. They didn't pose a threat to the facility's operations because, fortunately, the computers that were infected and weren't actually connected directly to the internet. Fortunately. One European airline has stated that it cleans its cockpits of planes every week of malware designed for Android phones. The malware spreads to the planes because employees charge their phones from the USB ports in the cockpit. And one of the places where poor security around internet-connected devices has become really evident is the hotel industry. This, for instance, is the door behind which I briefly lived. It was, in fact, my hotel room door when I was keynoting a conference in London 4 years ago now, I think. When I checked into this hotel, I was intrigued to see the locks were NFC-based rather than using the more common swipe card. Now, even today, NFC-based locks in hotels aren't amazingly common. Back then, I think this was the first time I'd ever seen one in the wild. I was intrigued. I was intrigued because I found this written in the back of the entry card. Every lock keeps a security record of every entry. This implied there was a bunch of data there. Well, this was a big data conference I was talking at, and I hadn't actually figured out what I was going to talk about. So I took the lock apart. The circuitry inside was more or less a straight off-the-shelf MIPS board. The board had 4 unpopulated contacts that were pretty obviously ground, power, TX, and RX. So I hooked up an Arduino and, yes, managed to copy the data from the lock. It had a record of every time the door had been opened over the course of the last month. Now, this lock wasn't connected to anything. The data was there stored for debugging purposes, perhaps. But 4 or 5 years on, locks like this are starting to be network accessible. Data like this is starting to appear on the network. For instance, one chap recently ran across a hotel that had replaced its light switches with our Android tablets. Using a borrowed pair of USB Ethernet adapters, he set up a transparent bridge and then stuck his laptop between one of the tablets and the wall. Turned out the tablets were communicating with the smart devices in the hotel using Modbus over TCP. Anyone know what Modbus is? Okay. Yeah, I wondered if you were going to be the guy that knew the Modbus. Okay. You were nodding in the right places. Now, Modbus, for those that don't know, is pretty trivial. Notably, it has no authentication whatsoever. You could therefore control his lights, his TV, and even make his curtains open and close. Then he noticed something. His room number was 714. The IP address he was using to communicate with was 172.18.207.14. 7.14, that was familiar. They wouldn't. I mean, yes, they obviously did. It was basically as bad as it could be. Once he'd figured out the gateway, you could access the control systems on every floor of the building and query the other rooms to figure out whether the lights were on or off. Curtains, open or closed, which strongly implies he could control them as well, although he didn't try. This isn't a one-off at all. There was a similar case a couple of years previously. Hotels, especially, although they're not alone, are happily deploying systems with no meaningful security whatsoever. And the outcome of a constant stream of set room lights to full and open curtain commands at 3 o'clock in the morning are going to be fairly predictable. One hotel I regularly stay at when I'm in London had a top-to-bottom renovation a couple of years ago now. Part of that renovation, every room ended up with one of these This is a Roberts Internet radio. And don't let the retro styling fool you. This is a powerful internet appliance. It bears little or no resemblance to the inside, on the inside to the radios we all grew up with. Now, soon after this hotel was renovated, every room given a radio, I found myself staying there. And I was sick, and I didn't really want to do the work I was supposed to be doing. And I got a little bored. And I wanted to change the radio station from my bed because I didn't really want to have to walk all the way across the room. Now, when I arrived in my room for the first time, the radio had been playing music. Fairly obviously, at least I devoutly hoped so, it hadn't been left on since the morning when they last cleaned the room. When I checked in, when I got assigned my room, at some point during my walk from the front desk to the elevator, the command had been sent to the radio to turn itself on, play the smooth jazz that greeted me when I entered the room. And sure enough, a few minutes later, poking around over settings revealed that it was on a Wi-Fi network. Interestingly, it wasn't the Wi-Fi network that the hotel was offering to guests, which was an open network that was just there, you could log on, it was all fine. This was a second hidden network dedicated to pushing music around all the hundreds of radios scattered around the hotel. Very sensible, I thought. Well done, then. Anyway, like a lot of IoT devices, this thing has an app. Now, the app requires, in fact, that your phone and the radio were on the same network. Many consumer IoT devices backed by cloud services don't, but this particular app did. Now, the hotel weren't using the radio in the same way the way the manufacturer thought they would. The radio and the phone and the radio and the app were not running on the same network. The app wasn't going to work for me. The hotel didn't care about that. But I did. I wanted to make use of it. Going back to that configuration menu, it proved really rather simple to flip the radio onto the customer-facing Wi-Fi network. Now I could use the app, and I could stay in bed and be lazy. Except I wasn't alone. These radios advertised themselves over the network using UPnP, and it seemed like a bunch of other people had done the exact same thing as me. Or not. Because the default behavior for these radios is to lock onto the first open Wi-Fi network they find. Consumer devices are supposed to be friendly. All you need to do to drop one of these things onto the guest-facing network was, instead of the hidden closed network, was do a factory reset. And I looked it up afterwards. There were a bunch of ways this could accidentally happen. Out of maybe a couple of hundred radios in the hotel, I could see 30-ish. Of course, if I wanted to access someone else's, not mine, I needed a PIN number. But if the radios were factory reset, surely the PIN number would be factory reset as well, right? Anyone want to take a guess? 1, 2, 3, 4. Exactly right. You guessed it. That worked in every single radio except mine. I had not done a factory reset. I just added a new network profile to the radio so I could flip it back onto the original network, because I'm a nice guy that way. But now I had control, if I wanted to, of around 15 to 20% of radios in the building. Can you imagine what I could have done to the hotel's business if I'd wanted to? Ever wanted to wake up to hard rock music at 4 a.m. in the morning with no way to turn it off whatsoever? Can you imagine the TripAdvisor reviews? This is a security vulnerability the hotel had because they'd taken a consumer-facing targeted device and deployed it in an industrial context. And let's not argue whether hotels are industrial context. They are. They'd done it because the radio, this internet appliance, was cooler, had more features, and was just more customer-friendly, and as a side, probably darn sight cheaper than the equivalent enterprise device. Of course, hotels are not the only place where legacy scatter protocols are getting exposed to IP-based systems. Driving one of these cars, you might want to think about that. At least right now, high-profile, large-scale deployments of Internet of Things, at least that involve the public, aren't actually that common yet. Most large-scale deployments are still quietly industrial, agricultural. So it's actually still pretty interesting to see something in the wild. A couple of times now, CES, technology show, has run a scavenger hunt. Who's been at CES? Wow, not hardware people at all. Okay, so CES is basically where you go to talk to people to buy hardware and where all the new fun devices are shown off. And they had this scavenger hunt. Based around iBeacon technology, participants needed to hunt 8 beacons scattered around the vast halls, 3 different venues of the CES show in Las Vegas. Both times they've run this hunt, I've managed to hack the hunt, fooling the CES app into thinking I've found all the beacons in one, except I've never actually been to CES. By decompiling the CES app, you can get the identities and locations of the beacons it's looking for and then fake them using a Raspberry Pi and 4 lines of Node.js. And fool the app, it's trivial. However, it turns out the fact that you can win the scavenger hunt from your desk wasn't the most interesting thing I found, at least not the second time I did this. Last year, along with the identities of the 8 hunt beacons, came the latitude and longitude of 1,000 other beacons, scattered amongst the 3 CES venues that, as long as you had the app installed, would be picked up by the app as you made your way around the show. Possibly intended for indoor navigation, the notifications they generated as you made your way around CES were at times a bit creepy. Also, looking at the decompiled code for the app, it looked like, sort of, each time the phone saw a beacon, it called home to report your location back to the powers that be. If it really did, then what was being compiled at the back end was a minute-by-minute log of your position as you walked around the CES show. Conceivably, it could be saved in the cloud and your location tracked the whole time you're there. Until recently, this sort of mass deployment of beacon technology has been rare, and there has been little debate about the privacy implications underlying them, about the security architectures you need so that you can't do things and just grab all this stuff from the cloud backend. This deployment by CES makes me think that we should have a debate soon before this sort of thing becomes commonplace. It makes me think we need a debate about privacy implications of the Internet of Things in general, because this sort of mass pseudo-anonymized surveillance isn't unique. I think most people are looking at security around the Internet of Things devices all wrong. They have it backwards. Right now, there are 3 big problems with the Internet of Things: security, refresh cycle, and standards. And we only ever seem to discuss security when we're talking about standards. We don't discuss the refresh cycle at all, not even when we're talking about standards, and I think that's actually the biggest problem. But to go back to security, the whole purpose of security is to protect people, not computers. And right now we're failing to do that. We're not protecting people. The way we're building these devices does not protect the people we're selling the devices to. There have been multiple ongoing initiatives over the past decade, both public and private, to try and remedy that. There have been dire warnings. I have given many. There have been publications of standards and best practices. I've done a bit of that too. There has even been legislation, none of which has been particularly effective. None of this has worked. Nobody in the industry today would argue that the Internet of Things is becoming more secure. In fact, in my opinion, most connected devices remain catastrophically insecure, and that's a real problem, because the Internet of Things is starting to make its way into the very fabric of our lives. So I want to leave you with just one more thing to ponder in the darkest hours of the night, in case the rest of the talk hasn't scared you enough. In the near future, the absence of data is going to be increasingly unusual. If you think about the data exhaust you leave behind you today is wide and varied, then just wait. It's going to get worse. But what happens if your data exhaust becomes assumed? What happens if there's a network outage or some other thing happens and you leave no trail? What happens if you're accused of murder during that time period and you can't prove where you were? Perhaps in the future that's going to be sufficiently unusual it's automatically suspicious. Innocent until proven guilty is a core tenet of our legal system. But that's because our current legal system was codified in a very different era, one that was data poor, not data rich. Perhaps in the future, the absence of data will imply guilt. It used to be you paid for publicity. Today you pay for privacy. What about tomorrow? Think about that in the dead of night. Thank you.
Got like 2 minutes for Q&A, I think. Because they're going to come in for the next one. So, one question. Given the reality that users don't or won't or don't understand that they need to have
There's a startup called resin.io that is doing automatic pushes of firmware builds to devices. They did a really quite impressive demo at one point where they did a real-time firmware update of a drone that was hovering on stage, and the drone sort of dropped like a couple of feet, and then the new firmware took over, and it started back to hover. So I think that was a sufficiently good demonstration that their stuff worked. So yeah, if you're looking for things like that, resin.io.
Yeah, I'm going to get ready for